Gabón, perdonen que empecemos un poco tarde. Parece que entre los aparatos de traducción simultánea y que hay gente que quiere entrar y no tiene entradas, y hay gente que tiene entradas y todavía no ha llegado, estamos retrasándonos un poco. Aprovecho para hacer un pequeño anuncio. Por favor, veo con máquinas de foto y flashes. Durante la charla no queremos que se saquen fotos. El profesor Hoffman nos lo ha pedido y ahí, por supuesto, nosotros encantados respetamos su deseo porque él quiere concentrarse en la charla y los flashes le distraen, ¿no? Bueno, yo quisiera empezar ya agradeciendo. A ver cómo voy aquí, cómo tengo esto. Ah, sí, ya estoy aquí. Esto es un acto organizado por el Campus de Excelencia de la Universidad, el Campus de Excelencia Internacional, con Euskampus y el Donostia International Physics Center, en colaboración con la Alhóndiga. Quisiera agradecer, en primer lugar, a la gente de la Alhóndiga la eficiencia, la amabilidad y que se han volcado con nosotros para hacer que este acto sea un éxito, como sin duda será. No está aquí, está organizando la entrada, pero yo quisiera expresar este agradecimiento a la Alhóndiga en la persona de Bárbara Epalza, que, junto con otros muchos, nos han hecho la vida fácil y agradable. Hay traducción simultánea, la habrá también para él en las preguntas del final. Al final se abrirá un turno de preguntas. Pueden preguntar en euskera o en castellano o directamente en inglés. Él tendrá también el sistema de traducción. Esperaremos un segundo para que se lo den al final de la charla. Bueno, eta ya honekin hasi nahi nuke esaten. Niretzako ohore handia dela arratsaldeko hizlaria aurkeztea, Rolf Hoffman irakaslea. Eta beste zer baino lehen, zer azpimarratu nahi nuke. Gaurko hitzaldia benetan gozatuko duzuela. Por favor, las fotos, como he dicho, que no se saquen fotos. Rolf Hoffman Polonian jaio zen, Bigarren Mundu Gerratik bizirik irten ondoren, bere familia ez zen irten, bizirik, ama bakarrik, 1959an Estatu Batuetara joan zen. Roalek Columbia Unibertsitatean ikasi zuen eta kimika fizikan doktoradua egin zuen 1975 urtean Harvarden eta geroztik Cornell Unibertsitatean egiten du lan. Rolek, imagina ditzazkezun sari gehienak jaso ditu. Bereziki, kimikako Nobel saria jaso zuen, erreakzio kimikoen bilakariari buruz egindako ikerkenagatik. Él empezó trabajando en una mezcla de física y química, la físico-química o la químico-física. Luego se dedicó fundamentalmente al campo de la química y en los últimos años se ha centrado en materiales extendidos, superficie, en física o de superficies, o también podríamos englobarla en materia condensada, en concreto en el campo de las altas presiones, materiales en extremas condiciones, donde ha colaborado con un gran amigo de la Universidad del País Vasco, Euskal Herriko Unibertsitatea, y del Donostia International Physics Center, Neil Ashcroft, y también con uno de nuestros profesores, con Aitor Vergara, que está aquí escuchando a Hoffman cuando él estuvo en Cornell. Además de su gran categoría como investigador, que es una de las luminarias de la química mundial, se ha dedicado y ha dado gran importancia a la divulgación. Incluso ha colaborado en la producción de un programa televisivo, El Mundo de la Química, que ha tenido un éxito impresionante. Pero además de eso, es un hombre polifacético, es un hombre con visión poliédrica. Es un gran escritor que ha cultivado el terreno entre la ciencia, la poesía y la filosofía a través de muchos ensayos y 3 libros. Hay un libro que a mí me es especialmente querido, The Same and Not the Same. En este libro, en 1995, ilumina y transforma e informa sobre la química en un lenguaje sencillo y sobre otros puntos de vista. Yo quisiera señalar que este libro fue calificado por Carl Gerasi, este es el descubridor de la píldora anticonceptiva, cómo él se refiere, a raíz de la presentación de este libro, a Rolf como uno de los más eruditos y humanos de los químicos vivos, también el último, el más supremo alquimista literario, porque en este libro sabe transformar los hechos de base en comprensión gozosa o comprensión de oro, de golden understanding. Yo creo que esto es importante. Ha sido una de sus características, es una profunda comprensión de cómo funciona la ciencia y la lucha contra el reduccionismo. El reduccionismo es pensar que la ciencia es una serie de campos con absoluta jerarquía, que lo importante es la física, en concreto la física de partículas, y lo demás es cocina o deducción como corolario de lo anterior. Según esto, la física sería el núcleo central del conocimiento, la química sería física aplicada. Esto solo se puede lograr olvidándonos todo lo que sabemos sobre la química. Él lo expresa de una forma bellísima, utilizando en un ensayo de una página, utilizando esta hermosa poesía de William Blake, y él se pregunta, por mucho que supiésemos cómo todas las neuronas disparan su electricidad, ¿entenderíamos la belleza de este pasaje? No. La belleza de este pasaje, por supuesto, que depende del sustrato físico, depende de cómo las neuronas funcionan, pero requiere lenguaje, simbolismo, ambigüedades y requiere también psicología y emociones. Yo he visto pocos ensayos tan brillantes como este para explicar por qué el reduccionismo no es correcto en ciencia. Además, ha escrito obras de teatro, en concreto una con el que le hace esta alabanza tan hermosa y cierta, con Gerasi, que he citado antes, que es una obra sobre el oxígeno, una obra de teatro que se ha representado en muchísimos países. Fíjese lo que dice Darío Fo, el Premio Nobel de Literatura, sobre esta obra. Gracias a ustedes y a su comedia, ahora sé todo sobre el oxígeno y el aire, y entiendo por qué San Francisco alababa a Dios por haberlo creado. Por encima de todo, Rolf Hoffmann es un profesor, un universitario. Es un líder intelectual y ético. Hoy explicaba cómo él y su madre sobrevivieron gracias a la humanidad de una familia ucraniana que en 1943 los ocultó en su buhardilla y luego pudieron ir a los Estados Unidos. Por eso, en ese mismo libro tiene un ensayo bellísimo que no es malo recordar aquí en el País Vasco, sobre ellos y nosotros, ¿no? En definitiva, el mensaje que ellos tienen mucho de nosotros y nosotros mucho de ellos. Estas divisiones entre nosotros y ellos no llevan a ninguna buena cosa. En resumen, es un hombre que tiene pasión por conocer, pasión por avanzar y por comunicar el conocimiento. Por eso se llama Roald, es un explorador de campos nuevos. Sus padres le pusieron Roald en honor del noruego Amundsen, que fue un explorador y un descubridor. Having said that, I better stop speaking and without further delay give the floor to our guest speaker today, Professor Hoffmann. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Pedro. If we switch to my talk. So, I want to tell you about chemistry. It is not an easy task, and also what I will tell you will be a little different from what you have normally heard about chemistry. I will take 3 views of chemistry, and eventually in time I hope to justify what is somewhat mysterious in the title, and that is the essential tensions and also the in culture. So there always was chemistry, and in the first of my 3 views, I want to tell you a little bit about a definition of chemistry. This is a definition which is very old. and that is that chemistry was and is still the art, craft, and business of substances and their transformations, of things and things changing. Now, let me give you an illustration. Here are, at the top of the picture, 3 works of masterpieces of ancient art. At left, a wall painting from Luxor in Thebes, in Egypt, a mere 3,500 years old. At the center, you see the gate of Ishtar, which once stood in Babylon, and then, through a feat of imperialism, for a change not American, but German, found its way to Berlin. And at right, you see an example of a Hellenistic wall painting from around the time of Christ, a period of realistic representation which preceded the Italian Renaissance by 1,500 years. You see a green or a blue color in all of these, and that green or blue was not a natural product, which was available then as it was to Giotto in painting the Padua chapel. And that natural product is at lower left. It is lapis lazuli. When powdered, becomes the pigment ultramarine. And if the painter has enough money, if his patrons give him enough money, you can use that ultramarine. And that is what Giotto used. But the blue in these paintings is not ultramarine. It is a product of chemistry. And yes, a product of chemistry that preceded the existence of the word chemist and of the profession. It was a product of human transformation. It is a product of the Egyptian mastery of glass and enamel. It has the usual components of glass, of quartz and sodium carbonate, natron, which the Egyptians mastered, and mixed into it, and what gives it the blue color is a mineral of copper. And this material, which you see powdered in the middle, was made, transformed by human beings, by chemical actions. Over a period of 2,000 years, this was an article of trade. So this was chemistry. As I said, it preceded, and it still is, the transformation. Now, in order to really show you the transformation in what I would need to do here is to do a demonstration. And even though I know that this building is dedicated to people doing things with their hands and minds, I did not know if the safety committee of the Al-Hondaba would allow me to blow up something on stage here. So I have brought some slides. Here are 2 substances. At the left, a brown red liquid, bromine, one of the elements with its vapor above it. At right, another of the elements, aluminum. Both of these were not around 210 years ago. They were made at the beginning, in their pure form, at the beginning of the 19th century. You place one of the elements into the other, you put the 2 together, and what you get is, as you can see, smoke, flames, foul odors, absolutely everything you expected of chemistry. And at the end is something different, something totally different from what you began with. A chemical transformation has taken place. This happens to be a complicated compound, an aluminum bromide, the result of a chemical reaction. This was chemistry. This is chemistry. these stinks and bangs, as well as beautiful colors and crystals, are what still attracts young people to chemistry done with their hands on macroscopic amounts of material. There is an interesting consequence. Oh, this is chemistry, and it looks explosive, but this is also chemistry. It is chemistry that is done by these little living organisms before they go into and are cooked in the oil with the garlic. And the cooking itself is chemistry. It is a transformation of the proteins in the little eels. And then further chemistry takes place when we eat these. All of these are chemistries, but they are not as spectacular. They are slower than an explosion, but these things taste much better. So, and there is incidentally chemistry in the artificial version of these little eels that is sold. There is some further chemistry. Anyway, a consequence of this basic transformation is, especially the parts of it which are seen as being violent in some way, is that there is a popular image of chemistry that results. And this is summarized in this 1942 Donald Duck comic book from Walt Disney. And this was done, the whole comic book, some 30 pages of it were done by one artist who also wrote the story, Carl Barks, an early co-worker of Walt Disney. Today there would be 150 people sitting at gleaming computers making the same comic book. Here is the cover. Here is a description of the first page. You cannot see what happens, but you don't need to see because you know what happens in Donald Duck comic books. Donald Duck comes in, the nephews are doing something, Donald Duck does something stupid, there is an explosion, there is always an egg upon the head, nobody is wearing safety glasses in this, and there is a little bit of chemistry at the end. Actually, what is interesting, and I have enlarged, is the next panel in the comic book, where Donald Duck says, if I mix CH2 with NH4 and boil the atoms in osmotic fog, I should get speckled nitrogen, and the nephews answer appropriately. What is interesting about this? This experiment has never been done yet. And if you are a chemist, you will perhaps know why it is difficult to react neutral NH4 with neutral CH2. I show this to you for fun. Of course, if the Basque economy is going to benefit from the chemical industry in this country, it is not going to be done in a Donald Duck mode of doing chemical reactions. Chemical reactions, explosions, are an extreme waste of energy and of the material. It goes in every direction. You don't make something useful. Even in the engine of your car, where there is an explosion, it's a very controlled one, the burning of the fuel in your car. And this is modern chemistry, whether done in a small laboratory or in a large chemical plant, is done with extreme efficiency to make the things that they are, that we have. But still that image of Donald Duck is associated with our picture of chemistry. I want to show you another interesting consequence of that initial definition of chemistry, that is, chemists are transforming matter. And this is an interesting episode which took place over 1,000 years, from roughly before the time of Christ till medieval times, and continues to some extent today. This is the story of alchemy. And what you are going to get from me is a different view of alchemy. Alchemy is usually viewed by chemists as a pseudoscience, as an episode which should have been avoided, and that is not my view of alchemy. Here are some typical alchemical illustrations that to show you what happened. And this perhaps tells you a little bit about how different alchemy is. In the back of this picture, which goes back to around 1700, there is a king and a queen being married by a bishop. And in front are some people doing chemistry. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, it was given to me to go to a number of hippie weddings. And at some of these, some chemistry was done. But it was not this chemistry. Obviously, the chemistry in front is symbolic in some way of the chemistry in the background. This is not an illustration of a real chemical laboratory. There is something here about the marriage of the elements. And what is happening in the background can be also viewed as symbolic of what is happening in front. So the usual view of alchemy as a pseudoscience is, I think, not right. I think alchemy is an interesting situation where there was a philosophy of transformation, often counter-religious or viewed as a threat by whatever religious system it arose in, because the religious systems wanted to have a monopoly on transformation, on creation, on resurrection, on all the ways that we have. But alchemy had a deep hold on the imagination because it took part of some of the basic myths. Oh, in my vocabulary, myth is a very good word. It took part of some of the basic myths of transformation that human beings have found important. I am talking about Persephone returning from the dead. I am talking about Phoenix rising from the ashes. I am talking about reincarnation. I am talking about the resurrection. These are all things which go away and come back. And that is what alchemy was about. It was a philosophy of transformation. It was very complicated. And so in order to get into people's mind with it seized upon something that already to people meant transformation. And this is chemistry. And then the alchemists started doing chemistry and did some very good chemistry. And I would say they were co-opted by chemistry. So this here is a view. Now, alchemists also promised, what transformations were they interested in doing? Of course, of a sick person into a healthy one. Of course, of a poor person into a wealthy one, the transformation of lead into gold. And in the process, they ran into some charlatanism, and the alchemists sometimes didn't realize that the man who promised to turn lead into gold was to the rulers of his principality an economic commodity to be kept from other rulers. And so alchemists were imprisoned and forced to make gold on order. And of course, when they didn't, this is what happened to them, just to have a symbol. But here is another alchemical painting. This is Duke Lodovico de' Medici in 1570. He is dedicating his new alchemical laboratory. And the Duke is in a yellow tunic over here, seemingly making an omelet. The central figure is Bianca Capello, a remarkable androgynous figure, his then mistress and later second wife. And all around are the people doing the experiments. This is one of the early illustrations of a chemical laboratory. And if you think that the role of science in society is greater today than it was then, I would like you to think whether today, if my university dedicates a chemical laboratory, it is extremely unlikely that I will get President Obama to come and be painted in the dedication of that laboratory. But here is a ruler of a state having himself taking part of a scientific experiment. Now, that is the end of my first definition of chemistry. What happened next, especially in the last 200 years, is that we learned how to look inside these substances undergoing transformations. And what we found there was that on a microscopic level, those substances undergoing transformations were, that in them were atoms. And much more interesting than atoms, there were persistent groupings of atoms called molecules. And so with time, there came to be a microscopic view of chemistry as the art, craft, and business, and now finally science, of molecules and their transformations. And in both cases, the transformations are very important in this picture. So let me show you some of these molecules. Here are some typical molecules, and the reason I show them to you is that they are beautifully simple and simply beautiful. I don't have to tell you that the molecule that looks like a platonic solid, a tetrahedron of carbons with 4 hydrogens, a cube of carbons, cubane, dodecahedrane, and at lower right, a molecule that should be on a flag of Brazil, that this molecule is beautiful. These molecules have a direct line into our soul. They are some of them are simple to make, some are difficult to make. For the young people in the audience, I will say something. I will tell you something later also about these molecules, which I want you to reflect on when you think that everything in the world might have been done and there's no room for you to do anything. What I want to tell you is all of these molecules were made by specific human beings at a certain time in the 20th century. And they all now today can be bought for a certain number of euros per gram. And what I want to tell you is that the cheapest of these molecules today, therefore the easiest to make, the price reflects the difficulty of making. The easiest of these molecules to make, the cheapest to be made, was the one that was made last, chronologically. I would like you to think about what that means about the future. Now, the moment I show you these molecules, I feel guilty. The reason I feel guilty is just because they have such an easy time into our soul, and that I don't have to tell you that they're beautiful. But when I show you this, a molecule with 9,500 atoms approximately, about 4,500 hydrogens, about 2,700 carbons, about 700 nitrogens, roughly an equal number of oxygens, 12 sulfurs, and exactly 4 iron atoms in this molecule. This molecule does not have a direct line into our soul. It looks like a mess. And let's look at it another way. We strip away the hydrogens. We try to get at its essence. Human beings have different representations of complicated things. And so here, what you see is a little helix running through this. And you should compare the sense of the helices with the sense of the helices in the columns outside in this building. And you see here little green, little platelet-like segments, at the center of which you cannot see them is an iron atom. That is where the oxygen is held. Oops, I have given away what this molecule does, which is, and what it is. This is hemoglobin, the oxygen carrier in our blood. It is the biochemical molecule that we know more about than any other biochemical molecule in the world. It occupies 2 chapters in any textbook of biochemistry, and it is not simply beautiful. Someone had to take me by the hand to see this thing which looks like some pasta congealed from primordial soup, like a dance of some tapeworms. This molecule is not simple. And chemistry in this world is positioned between the complexity of hemoglobin. Of course it is complex because it performs an exquisite function. How could anything that does something complicated as to carry the oxygen and to respond to the acidity of the blood and to release the oxygen of the cell, how could anything that does something so specific be simple? Simplicity is not a recipe for function. Complexity is. And so this thing here is, chemistry is positioned between the extremes of those simple molecules and those of this complex molecule, and probably is closer to this complex molecule. So that is the reason I feel guilty about this. This object across is about 5 times 10 to the minus 7th centimeters across, about 5 nanometers across, actually, and it is a small construction. One thing that is seen very clearly, probably overemphasized by the models that we use to represent these molecules. If you saw a realistic picture of this, the atoms would not be sitting still, but would be vibrating, and the whole thing would be pulsating before your eyes, and you would not see it very well. So it's been simplified, but clearly you get an architectonic sense. This is a structure, and organic chemists and biochemists and polymer chemists can build structures like these on demand. We'll see some a little bit later on. But the point I want to make is that if we go 12 orders of magnitude, 12 powers of 10, upscale from the size of these microscopic objects, we get to the scale of about 100 meters. And in that scale of 100 meters, I think I may have said 10 to the minus 7th meters, I meant centimeters. On that scale of about 100 meters, we get to the size of what we normally consider architecture. This building, the Guggenheim Museum, and it's interesting that in the architecture of structures that human beings build, if they have enough money to build them, that is in these structures is played out the same competition for our mind between the elements of simplicity and complexity that was played out in these molecules. Let me make the point clear. I could show you the Parthenon in Greece, but I show you the Taj Mahal, a high point of Islamic architecture in Agra. This is the aesthetic of simplicity. The bilateral symmetry of this object goes directly into our soul. It is beautiful. But then we go to the Guggenheim Museum, or we can go in a past. This is the Transparente in Toledo, an incredible object of Baroque Rococo architecture. If any line can be made curved, it will be. And the power of this object has nothing to do with simplicity. It has everything to do with the complexity and our interaction, though there is a simple space coming here. These things are playing with the human mind, and it's not just in Spain. You can go to Madurai in southern India. You see this immensely complicated object sculptures on a rather simple pyramid of a Hindu temple. And it's played out in another way. I'm back, of course, in Barcelona now. This is the gatehouse of Parc Güell. And you see here a building that is different from every direction that you look in it. Perhaps the fair situation is to move up in Parc Güell to the benches. And what you see there is really the playing out for the human mind by a great architect and Ju Joel, who worked with him on the ceramics here. You see here a set of benches, a balustrade, and it is regular. It's not a straight line. Curved lines are always more interesting than straight lines. And it is a wavy line, but regular. That sets a foundation of rest and repose and order. But on top of that, look at the mosaic. The mosaic is playing with our mind. You and I could imagine another mosaic. You and I could imagine black and white regular diamonds going along that. But how much more interesting is it that not only are there not regular shapes, but there are some regular shapes, and there are circles, and some are filled and some are not filled. And our mind subconsciously, as it views this mosaic, finds it interesting because we don't know why the artist has filled some with regularly and some irregularly. So this is a play of complexity and simplicity, which is at the heart of good art and of good science. The third view that I want to give you of chemistry is now very different. It's a psychological view, and that is how people think of chemistry. Now, I already showed you some of that. This is one image that people have of chemistry. Chemists are the people who make things go bang. Okay? So that is something we have to live with. But let me show you another view of chemistry. This is a complicated slide, but I will explain it. This is on one axis, this is a slide about survival of children a certain number of years after diagnosis with 8 kinds of tumors. I don't know what some of these are, but some I know, brain tumors. And this is what is plotted vertically is the survival rate of the children 5 years after diagnosis with these tumors in the United States. And on the other axis is a time axis. And in this very complicated slide, there are also bars at the bottom. And you cannot read the bars, but I'll tell you what they are. These are different therapeutic techniques which began at a certain time. So one had surgery all along, but around the time of the end of the Second World War, radiotherapy came online. Rather interesting, you have read about Marie Curie, who deservedly gets a lot of credit for introducing radium into the therapy for tumors, but there never was enough radium, never enough radioactive materials to do effective therapy on large numbers of people until they were produced in the atomic bomb research. So the story is complicated. At some point around 1960, there began conventional chemotherapy, and around 1975, intensive chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is, as you know from knowing people who have had it, is a way of feeding an individual a cocktail of several chemicals which kill tumor cells marginally faster than they kill normal cells. It is not a very easy thing to get through chemotherapy and has many side effects. But what I see in this slide is very clearly that for 6 of the 8 tumors, nothing helped until chemotherapy came in. And then the survival rates went up to 75 to 95%. But for two of the tumors are still waiting for the young people in the audience to find a chemotherapy agent that might be help with those. This slide represents about 500,000 children's lives saved from chemotherapy, and it is a part of the evidence I would propose for the utility of chemistry. I know it's medicine also, but I will take all the credit for chemistry. This shows something about the utility of chemistry. However, out of the back doors of the companies that are making these chemotherapy agents comes this. And no, it is not those companies, because those companies are under great public view. And it's always somebody else. It's never us. But this is just a symbol of the infinity of ways that we have found to foul our own nest, where for the best of reasons to improve our standard of living, to help with the health of children, we produce waste. And this is just a symbol for ecological and environmental damage done due to that same chemical production that help people. And this leads to a two-faced image of chemistry in modern times. Remember, I'm talking about the perceptions by people of chemistry. That's what I want to talk about. And it's a two-faced perception in terms of harm and benefit that you see in this slide. And that was so evidenced by that symbolically evidenced. And now that actually gets me to talk about essential tensions. Chemistry seems quiet, if not boring, and it seems, but I want to try to convince you that chemistry is a tense science, that it has tensions in it. And tensions, I know we complain about tensions, but tensions are what makes life interesting. And so I want to tell you a little about that. What tensions am I talking about? Tensions are usually easiest described in terms of two polarities or opposites and a motion, a competition of the two for what you have. I have already talked about some. I didn't tell you about this. I let it pass by. But one of the tensions is between macro and micro, between what you see and what is inside. And remember the first slide I showed you was of a pigment that was some Egyptian blue that is used to this day for the color blue. Well, inside of it is a structure. There are tetrahedra of atoms around the silicon, which is bonded to some oxygens. And the viewing of these two, in the language of chemists, you see this tension, though they don't think about it. They talk about substances, but they think about molecules. They think about what you need to do to transform something. It's quite mixed up, macro and macro. Here is another one, simplicity, complexity, another tension. Molecules are simple, molecules are complex. How do we deal with that? Here is the harm benefit, to me summarized in one slide. So, anybody in this audience who has had an operation knows what morphine is good for. I don't have to tell you. But that same morphine whose structure shown at right, here as an injectable medium, that same morphine is addictive, and in a hospital, they will try to get you off it as quickly as possible. That same morphine can be transformed into a deadly addictive drug, heroin. It's not any different molecule. It's the same molecule. Okay? So this is the tension, that the same molecule can hurt you and heal you. And we play this out every time we go to our doctor and ask for a prescription for a child with a fever. We want that drug to heal, and we worry about its side effects. Now, I think that's interesting. It puts chemistry on a human scale. I love big galaxies, as you can see with the Hubble telescope, and I love quarks and gluons. But quarks and gluons and big galaxies will not hurt you, nor will they heal you. These molecules will. And that is what makes them very much on a human scale. Here is another tension in chemistry. This is between natural and unnatural. Instead of unnatural, we can use man and woman made, and artifactual, synthetic, but I use unnatural to get the full range of negative reactions that we have acquired in this word. And this is not so simple, because what looks to be at left, I mean, how could we imagine life without plants of the Allium family? And that is natural. At right, everyone clearly says that's unnatural. Well, it's not so simple, friends. A few garlic plants is natural. growing on a wild mountainside. A field of garlic is agriculture, and agriculture is a manipulation by human beings of natural organisms in unnatural ways. Even if you don't use any herbicide or pesticide, that field didn't want to be all garlic. It wanted to be something else. And you have made it a field of garlic. So the natural-unnatural division is not so obvious around living things. In fact, not only chemists, but all human beings use the natural. We all transform the natural in our buildings, in our tools. The relationship is really quite ambiguous. And let me leave you all with a question on that, which I will not give you the answer to. Everyone thinks that cotton is a natural fiber, and nylon, and knows that nylon is a synthetic fiber, and people in general don't know what a rayon is, viscose rayon. It's a semi-synthetic fiber. But I'd like you to think all of these came eventually from a plant. I can tell you. All of them came from a living plant, eventually through human transformation. And I would like you to think which of the seeds of the plant that eventually through human transformation led to cotton, rayon, or nylon could claim to be truly natural in the sense of never having been touched by a human being. Now, let's talk about some other tensions. These are not the only ones, the ones I've talked to you about. I also talked about symmetry and asymmetry. One interesting one is creation and discovery. So chemists are a little different from other scientists, that the usual thinking about a science, that scientists discover the laws of nature, for instance. That is based on a definition which comes from looking at physics. What is interesting about chemists is that chemists are as much into creation as they are into discovery. They make new molecules. They also discover new ways of making old molecules. They also discover the structure of what is there in nature. Here is what is called in English a yew tree. I should have gotten the species. But from that bark of the tree is isolated a complicated molecule whose structure you see at upper right, another representation at lower right. The molecule is called Taxol. It is an important anti-tumor agent, very reactive in defeating certain tumors. That Taxol, the discovery of it in the bark of the yew tree, was a discovery mode, uncovering the secrets of nature. Out of the bark of a single yew tree, which takes 200 years to grow to maturity, you can get enough doses to treat about 4 people for the tumor. If you want an anti-tumor pharmaceutical, you have to make that Taxol synthetically in the laboratory, and that chemists have done. And you cannot just cut down the trees. So chemists make things, and that is a very interesting balance. With that, there comes ethical responsibility, and I am not sure that my colleagues are so good at it. Whether you make a molecule or a gun or write a poem, you have some responsibility for its use, and perhaps even for misuse, or that's something very interesting to talk about. So that there are ethical considerations that always come with creation, whether it is of a child or a molecule. This is another tension in chemistry. Here are 4 white substances. Now, chemists have added 70 million compounds in 200 years of activity to what was there in the natural world. They're doing so at the rate of 500,000 to 1 million new molecules a year. 95% of them are white crystalline powders, pure. One of these is aspirin, one is saxitoxin, the terrible active neurotoxin from the red tide organism. One of them is salt, another one is sugar. Are you going to play Russian roulette with these if someone asks you to taste them? You know, if you don't know, your body knows. And so what is going on here? Well, one is that you want to know what is inside. They're all white. They all look the same. This is why the book that Pedro showed you a picture of is called The Same and Not the Same. Because to me, this is the most basic tension in chemistry, that of similarity and difference. Are two things the same or are they different? And that is exemplified to me by this, but it is a basic tension. And to me, that is interesting because it sets up a connection with psychological questions that we have of our identity. How are we the same or different from our parents, from our sisters or brothers, from people of another ethnicity or country? These are questions of identity, of being the same and different, and they're resolved in, they're much more complicated questions than the one over here. I come now to the end of the three pictures, and this painting here by Bala is just to call up what you have seen me do again and again, and that is to use works of art as examples to deal with the science. This is something which is very important to me, and I am interested in this intersection. But this is meant to remind me also that I want to give one more something about works of art and science, and I want to show something again to the young people in the audience. So here is a masterpiece of chemistry. This auditorium is not a chemistry classroom. If it were a chemistry classroom, this would be on the wall. This is the icon of chemistry, Mendeleev's periodic table of the elements, much more complicated than Mendeleev imagined and interesting in a great variety of ways. That's not why I show it to you. I show it to you because when I looked at this in a lecture room, when I took introductory chemistry at the university, I thought, how could I possibly do anything new? And making a new element to add to the table was not very interesting. How could I, as a young person, hope to achieve a chemical masterpiece? Well, it is a feeling that young people have. I think in order to answer that question, as with any masterpiece, I think it is important to admire the masterpiece. That has a place. But you should look at how the masterpiece was made. And so for this, you have to go to historians of science. You might think you should go to Mendeleev himself or what he has written, but historians of science have learned that in the stories of discovery, they should take the testimony of the people who did it as important testimony, but with a certain grain of salt. The reason is that if it is an important discovery, the person is asked to talk about it many times, He tells a story, and the story gets better every time he tells it. And in the case of Mendeleev, he said that he was writing a textbook. That was correct. He said he put the weights of the elements that were just settled 7 years before he did this, in 1860. He did this in 1867. He said he wrote the names of the elements on a deck of playing cards and then shuffled the cards to bring them into a certain order, and out of that came the table. Historians have looked in his well-preserved papers. There are no playing cards, which is no evidence. But what they find is this. So here is, from Mendeleev's notebooks, the first place when he writes down the periodic table. So what he does, like any human being, the symbols of the elements were already in place in 1867. They had been since the 1830s, when they were suggested by the leading chemist of the era, Jöns Jacob Berzelius. And so the element symbols are the same as they are today. And what he does is he makes here, like any human being trying to get order out of things, you begin by stalling for time by making a list. Okay, so he makes a list of the elements with their atomic weights above them, and as he fits them into the table, he crosses them out. He's writing in a mixture of Russian and German, because he studied in Germany, and there are 3 elements that on the first completion he cannot fit into the table. He is a theoretician. It is in the nature of theoreticians to make things fit in that don't fit in. He gets them in. But what is the most beautiful thing, and the thing that I want to notice about this? The most beautiful thing is the crossing out, of course. This is the prima facie evidence that this is a human being like you and me, not a machine. Machines don't cross out. This is a human being struggling to understand the peace of the world and getting it at the end, but on the way making mistakes. There is nothing more human than making mistakes. Okay, so this is science, and people can believe that scientists make mistakes and on their struggle. But we are very funny human beings. We think that there must be some aspect of human creativity where perspiration doesn't matter and when inspiration counts. And the usual focus of such romantic notions are poets. So the idea is that poets walk the whole day around on a day when it's not raining in Bilbao, and they, at the right moment, at the end of the day, they take out a notebook and a pencil, like I am always carrying around, and they write down the poem, sprung like Athena from Zeus's brow. In one fell swoop, the poem is given unto them. Well, let me show you what happens. Here is a well-known poem in the English language. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? By William Blake. Well, here is the last draft of that poem. And we know it's the last draft because there's the printer's mark. It was printed actually from this. But you see he's got most of the first 3 stanzas right, not the 4th one. But he also has a phrase here, dare grasp, instead of could frame, as it winds up in the final version. And he dare grasp or dread grasp. So he doesn't use it. It doesn't fit in there. So he tries it down here. And it doesn't fit in there. He finds a place for it. Those 2 words are a poetic phrase. They mean more than the sum of the 2 words. he is going to use that. So now I come to the last slide of the lecture. This has science and art here combined. I don't want to tell you that these are identical. What I want to be sure to leave the young people in the audience with is the idea that what you see here, don't look at masterworks. Yes, look at masterworks and use them, but don't view masterworks as a barrier to your own creation. When I show you these, you can see in a great poem, in the construction of periodic table, human beings desperately trying to understand this beautiful and terrible world, and coming up with some part of that understanding. Thank you very much.
Well, el profesor Hoffman contestará preguntas. Los que quieran hacerlo, que levanten la mano para que se les dé el micrófono, puedan oírle todos los demás y también los traductores. Yo intentaré ordenar las palabras, sino el orden de intervención. Rod me decía, en este tipo de charlas la gente no se atreve a preguntar y yo le he hecho una apuesta. En Bilbao seguro que sí, así que por favor no me hagan perder la apuesta. Venga.
Yeah, there are questions.
Yes,
Yes.
please. Wait for the microphone for the translators and for the audience to listen, please.
Should I make it in English or in Spanish?
Either way.
Okay. So chemistry is in an interesting middle point between physics and biology. And we know that you worked also in condensed matter physics. Yes. So my question to you is, do you think that in 21st century chemistry, how much chemistry should rely on fundamentals in physics, and how much biology should rely on physics and chemistry?
Well, this in some way touches on this reductionism story. So I think we gain one kind of understanding in chemistry from looking at the underlying physics. If we waited for the physicists to understand every aspect of the Taxol molecule, that molecule would never have been made. Absolutely never. That molecule was made on the basis of partial understanding and on the basis of ideas that are inherently chemical and that are not reducible to physics. So I think that much that is interesting in chemistry is of that category. The same way also in biology. There is a tendency in our romance with molecular biology to think of everything as being reducible to molecules, but it's the same kind of, we see the complexity, it's the same kind of problem. The idea of one gene, one trait is not very productive. We see that there are relatively few genes, and the interactions of these pieces of DNA with each other, mediated by proteins, create a complexity which we did not anticipate. I think there is still a lot left in biology that is not reducible to chemistry. Though some of my colleagues would not agree in that. So anyway, in the future, I think there is a lot of things that will be still done. If we take, for instance, the finding chemical processes which go with a minimum production of wastes in water as a solvent instead of organic solvents, the making of such industrial processes, I don't think is going to rely on the reduction of those things to physics and on quantum mechanical calculations, which is what I do. I think they may play a small role, but they will still be traditional chemistry. There's an awful lot of work left to do.
Sí. Comentar, un rey de la Edad Media Alta española, Alfonso de Castilla, que decía que el sistema de Ptolomeo, que era realmente un lío y que con todos los respetos a Dios él lo hubiera hecho mejor. Y algunos hoy día dicen que la próstata también, que es un lío y que se podría haber hecho mejor. Respecto a los productos naturales, ¿usted cree que algunos también se podrían haber hecho mejor? Y respecto a la tensión natural, no natural, usted cuando habla de la hemoglobina, bueno, aventuraría que se podrían hacer cosas natural, no natural, que diría, esto yo lo hubiera hecho mejor que el creador. Perdone la broma.
I think that people right now are designing some enzymes that can carry out steps that have not been done naturally. I don't think we can duplicate at all the evolved natural world through our chemical experiments in all of its complexity. I think we can do some small pieces of it better than nature does, but small pieces only, very well-defined small pieces. But to duplicate, what you can say is that the process of evolution is just very many experiments done by nature over a very long period of time. To duplicate the whole process, or even a piece of it as small as making a good Rioja wine from the grapes, that small piece would involve a complexity which is beyond the number of human beings and number of chemists that are around in this world. So I don't think we can get that. Incidentally, about natural, unnatural, in that Rioja wine, the aroma of that good wine, in that aroma have been identified 900 molecules. Nothing natural is simple. So this interesting intersection of natural, unnatural, simple, complex. Only the minds of human beings are simple. There are good reasons why nature has chosen the road of complexity to accomplish all those functions, not that they were teleologically intended. But to get that variety of function to many molecules, there's a reason why there is complexity, and that's an example of it. By far the purest substances in all our environment are those in chemical laboratories. Even the most pure, seemingly pure natural product in our environment, which is probably cane sugar, in addition to some pharmaceuticals, is impure at a parts per million, parts per billion level. Things in the laboratory can be made more pure and often are.
Sí, yo le quería preguntar sobre el control de los productos químicos, porque bueno, yo he en algún reportaje, si he visto algún documental y así, donde dicen que en cualquiera, en la sangre, el torrente sanguíneo de cualquiera de nosotros está lleno de tóxicos por la cantidad de productos químicos tóxicos que hay en casi todos los productos que consumimos, incluso yo que sé, en unas sandalias de goma, en todas partes está nuestro cuerpo venga a absorber venenos, en realidad, y esto no está nada controlado, o sea que esas cosas se venden y tal, y es como una bomba de relojería que de hecho ya la estamos pagando en forma de cánceres y de infertilidad, entre otras cosas. Me gustaría saber cuál es su opinión sobre qué se puede hacer para que no sigamos envenenándonos con todos los elementos químicos que no están controlados por las autoridades.
Yes, so this is our problem, that our powers to create these new chemicals are running faster, and our desire to use them as part of things that improve our environment is running faster than our ability to know their effects on human beings. The world is made out of lots of chemicals. It matters how much you get of them, whether they are harmful or not. A little bit of selenium is necessary. A lot of selenium is not good for you. You can be killed by salt, which is otherwise a normal chemical, just to take a typical one. We try in the governments and the manufacturers as well, because they have seen too many cases where a company has gone down when a product has been really harmful. We try through our government agencies to make some estimate of the toxicity of the chemicals, but we cannot, in the ultimate analysis, know completely, and then there comes a real problem. At what point do we allow something that is that we don't know its effects? When do we decide not to allow it into the environment? I don't have a good answer. I think we just have to keep trying to put into effect through our local and nationwide governments the ways to control chemicals, so that some of the toxic chemicals do not get to human beings, but or even to the animals that we know. It is something for the future. I think we will find better ways. But we are always, our creativity is running ahead of the caution that we have to take. Hi. Yes. Hi. Well,
thank you. Do you think people today, and especially young people, are afraid of making mistakes and therefore trying?
No, I don't think so. I think it seems to be inherent in young people that they are not afraid of making mistakes. Now, it is true that we usually have greater doubts about our own powers or abilities of imagination than about the abilities of other people. But I don't see any difference, and I have been teaching for 47 years, that I don't see any difference in both the attitudes of young people toward new knowledge in their powers. in their ability to believe in themselves. They always have to be encouraged to believe in themselves and to try to do something.
La mayor parte de los metabolitos secundarios hoy en día todavía no se han descubierto, pero como usted ha dicho, no es rentable una industria farmacéutica en la que solo se puedan explotar recursos naturales, porque no hay ni recursos naturales ni investigadores suficientes para producirlos. ¿Usted cuál cree que es el futuro de la química farmacéutica entonces?
I think by secondary metabolites you mean in the context of a pharmaceutical, what happens when it's broken down in our bodies. The pharmaceutical industries of this world are faced with a multitude of problems. This would require a whole lecture to talk about. There's questions of regulation and worries by governments, the amount of testing that's required. There's also questions about where they put their efforts. Should they put their effort on another mood or emotion changing pill rather than on a malaria drug? Another set of questions around there, policy questions. There are things about patents. I'm really not an expert, but I think we should care more about what the pharmaceuticals we use and other chemicals that enter in the environment. But I think it's not an excuse to not do anything. So I think one has to try.
Tiene la palabra, tienen dos señores el micrófono. Primero el de la tercera fila, por favor, que lleva esperando mucho tiempo, y luego de la octava o novena.
Yes.
Por favor.
Two more. Yes.
En una relación amorosa segregamos ciertas sustancias químicas que nos hacen sentir bien. Si una persona sostiene una relación por internet o por las nuevas tecnologías, segregaría las mismas cantidades de química, bueno, que le hiciera sentir bien. Esa es mi pregunta.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me, and when you started out your question, I thought you were going to ask me, will chemists succeed really in making a love potion? A dream, yes? Yes, well, the internet has ways of affecting our behavior. Good question. Next one.
Okay, we have two more questions that I have already agreed, and then we will conclude, because tomorrow morning Professor Hoffman has to take a plane at 6:30. So, first the one on the... Primero el que está ahí detrás, y después este señor que va a clausurar.
You have stressed the importance of hard work in getting master work, especially for young people, so they don't get discouraged.
Yes.
But what is the role of insight, inspiration? Don't you think that sometimes the great idea, comes quickly and likely on its own?
No. I think great ideas come in many ways, but essential, first of all, is trying, putting pen to paper, trying to write that poem, trying to do some chemistry. Second, it comes from attention to detail. But then, while paying attention to detail, looking for connections to the rest of this world. I believe that the world is to be found in a blade of grass. but everything in the world is connected to everything else. So keeping both those things going in young people. I have my doubts about inspiration in general. I think one just has to begin. I know myself on the right. I'm not saying that I'm not a good example because I'm not that good a poet, but I try. But I know that for me, what works if I cannot start a poem is simply walking in nature of some sort, a forest, a beach, and writing down what I see. So I'm beginning with simple things, and somehow eventually the emotional connection of the words that describe what I see, or their connection to my emotions or to emotions I want to communicate to someone else, eventually that'll come. So I think it all begins with work. Now, on the other hand, if the work is repetitive, if the work gets you tired and you cannot, and you don't know where you will get your next meal, it's hard to tell that person you are doing something which will lead to inspiration. So it is a balance.
Hola, buenas tardes. Usted mencionó antes el hecho de que el ser humano es el único animal que destruye su hábitat, y pues esto viene siendo pues por el hecho de que el ser humano ha conseguido dominar los elementos, lo natural y lo no natural, por lo que es la química en su propio estado lo que ha hecho que lleguemos a destruir este hábitat. Y mi pregunta es, ¿usted cree que en un futuro la química o la investigación en esta misma logrará remediar estos problemas, o tal vez deberíamos dejar de investigar y de realizar esta química y volver a un estado pues como estábamos antes, para que los problemas como el cambio climático, el agujero en la capa de ozono pues dejen de tener esta incidencia sobre la Tierra, sobre nuestro hábitat?
I think part of the solution will be technological. The larger part will be social and cultural. There was a time when the automobiles produced this great amount of pollutants, carbon monoxide, unburned hydrocarbons, nitric oxides. One had to learn that this is what was done. And then one tried to introduce laws to control that. And the automobile manufacturers, this was happened in the United States, resisted they said it was impossible to add too much to the cost of the automobile. Eventually, popular pressure in the state of California mounted to the passing of laws, and the state was so large, laws which mandated a reduction by a factor of 20 in these emissions. And the moment it was done, the moment the laws were passed, and not a second before that, then the automobile manufacturers and the research laboratories turned all their ingenuity to making those catalysts that, in fact, by now reduce carbon monoxide emissions by factors which exceed those which were mandated by a factor of 2 or 3. So the technology is there. They will not do anything unless we tell them through public pressure to do something, and then human ingenuity will solve that little problem. Incidentally, the reduction of carbon monoxide emissions as a side effect reduced that way of committing suicide around the world by running your car engine in a closed garage. You don't read much about that, do you? That was a side effect. This is not to say that there are not other ways of killing yourself, but that particular one was reduced by this technological advance. I'm not right. We have to put pressure on our governments We have to learn enough science to tell bad experts from good experts. We need more science education. We need more science to build a future.
Ok, con este mensaje, dándole a la última la posibilidad de luego preguntar en una discusión privada al profesor Hoffman, cuya amabilidad seguro que no le quiere dejar con el micrófono en la boca después de que este presentador no ha conseguido que separase las preguntas para darle su turno. Yo quiero concluir agradeciendo en primer lugar a la señora Epalza de la Alhóndiga por su amabilidad en colaborar con Euskampus y con el DIPC en organizar esta conferencia magnífica, y también a Nora González del DIPC y a Igor Campillo de Euskampus, y, cómo no, al Campus de Excelencia de la Universidad del País Vasco, el Campus de Excelencia Internacional de la Universidad del País Vasco, Euskal Herriko Unibertsitatea, bajo cuyo liderazgo se organizan este tipo de eventos, y, por supuesto, al profesor Hoffman, que, como han visto, yo tenía razón al principio, la conferencia ha sido espectacular y será una conferencia recordada durante mucho tiempo, por lo menos hasta el próximo año, donde yo intentaré convencerle que nos vuelva a visitar. Y a todos ustedes, muchas gracias por su asistencia y sus preguntas.